Chapter 12 Fatal Crises and First Obituaries. The 1980s didn't end up making the 1930s look like a picnic, but they did make Jimmy Carter's rightward turn in the late 1970s look like the calm before a storm, and the rightward course initiated under Carter ultimately came to be called Reaganism. Within weeks of assuming the presidency, Reagan threw down the gauntlet against every progressive force in the Third World. He declared that the U.S. was drawing the line in El Salvador and sent military advisors to help combat the popular insurgency led by the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, FMLN. The administration alleged that Cuban arms were flowing to the Salvadoran rebels through Nicaragua, gave the CIA a green light to build a full-fledged anti-Sandinista army, and hinted at military action against Cuba. Reagan also stepped up intervention in the Middle East and support for apartheid South Africa. To win popular support, or at least acquiescence for intervention in the Third World, the new administration endlessly repeated its claim that progressive movements worldwide were merely fronts for Soviet aggression. 3 months after Reagan took office, Secretary of State Alexander Haig declared that Soviet promotion of violence as the instrument of change constitutes the greatest danger to the world. To eliminate the Soviet threat at its source, the administration sought nuclear superiority, hoping to translate the U.S. scientific and technological edge into qualitative military advantage. All this was expensive. Analyzing the new president's first budget, the Christian Science Monitor reported that spending of such magnitude has no precedent in the peacetime history of the U.S. In 1986 alone, the nation's defenses will devour an estimated $367 billion, more than twice the sum spent on defense in 1980. In domestic policy, the administration moved just as decisively. It gave an immediate tax break to business and the wealthy while slashing social programs. All sectors of the working class were slated to feel the pinch, but the harshest cuts were reserved for those programs benefiting the least protected, disproportionately minority strata. Even the New York Times headlined its coverage of Reagan's budget, "Blacks would feel extra impact from cuts proposed by President." Simultaneously, the administration intensified the assault on programs explicitly addressing racial discrimination, for example, imposing massive cuts on the agencies responsible for civil rights enforcement. All this was accompanied by an ideological crusade to fan the flames of racial prejudice in order to win white support. Sadly, it yielded results. The budget cuts, which fall hardest on low-income Americans and blacks especially, have been swallowed in large part because there is hope among middle-income Americans that, coupled with Reagan's tax cut, they will make life easier for them, wrote mainstream columnists Jack W. Gurmand and Jules Wickover. Another top objective was undermining the trade union movement. Then when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers (PATCO) union went on strike in August 1981, Reagan decided to draw another line. Rather than negotiate, he gave the strikers an ultimatum, fired all those who did not return to work, and filled their jobs with permanent replacements. With this one stroke, the administration tore up the unwritten agreement that had governed employer policies during strikes since World War II and gave a green light to employer assaults on unions across the board. Reagan's anti-labor agenda also shaped his policy response to the recession that began in 1979 and lasted until 1982. This slump was the most severe since 1974 to 1975, and in some respects even steeper. It also contributed heavily to the debt crisis that gripped third world countries throughout the 1980s. The administration consciously aimed to deepen the recession in order to bring down the rate of inflation and strengthen the position of capital vis-a-vis labor. Reagan's fiscal policies accelerated the trend that began in the late 1970s toward corporate mergers, downsizing, plant closures, and relocating production to areas with cheaper labor. These were the years in which the phrase deindustrialization of America entered the mainstream political vocabulary, and the phenomenon was analyzed in depth in the radical 1982 book of that title. Deindustrialization's corollary was rising income inequality. Nearly 90% of the new jobs created during the 1960s and 1970s paid middle-income wages. During the 1980s, just over 1 of every 3 new jobs did. The percentage of union members among eligible U.S. workers, 32% in 1953 and still around 25% in 1970, had fallen to 18% by 1984 and would fall further to 16% at the end of the Reagan-Bush era in 1992. The percentage of the private sector workforce was even smaller. The administration also added its weight to the mounting assault on women's and lesbian gay rights. The Equal Rights Amendment was stonewalled, and rather than move quickly to address the health crisis brought by the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, which first was identified in the U.S. in 1981, the administration pursued policies that went beyond criminal neglect to fan anti-gay hysteria. The standard-bearers' collapse. Reagan's policies provoked widespread anxiety and popular opposition. As different movements mobilized and searched for allies, a hunger for fresh strategies, broad coalitions, and militant leadership made itself felt. This created new openings for left organizations to take initiative. Even had they been at peak form, the largest anti-revisionist groups would have been able to constitute only a small part of an anti-Reagan advance guard. Their small size, if nothing else, precluded them from playing the central role they had anticipated back when the new communist movement was young. But as it turned out, the movement's late 1970s standard-bearers performed even worse. Instead of turning their energies outward toward stirring mass movements, the main organizations in each of the movement's rival wings sank into crisis and collapse. The CPML began its downward spiral in 1979. By the spring of that year, the negative impact of the group's policy of aiming its fire at progressive reformers became undeniable. Once influential cadre became isolated in mass movements, criticisms of out-of-touch leadership and lack of internal democracy rumbled through the ranks. The leadership responded with a campaign against the three evils of subjectivism, sectarianism, and bureaucracy. As first, this change in course was greeted enthusiastically by the membership. But unity did not exist at the organization's top levels on how far criticisms of ultra-leftism ought to go, and membership discontent had grown too great to be quelled by one short-term campaign. Then call editor and key leader Daniel Bernstein threw an even bigger wrench into the works by questioning the basic principles of Marxism-Leninism and calling the dictatorship of the proletariat thesis anti-democratic. Bernstein's heresy apparently stemmed from his observations during a 1978 trip to China and Kampuchea, where he was shaken by evidence of the damage inflicted by the Cultural Revolution and by Pol Pot's genocidal killings. Though remaining publicly silent on the latter atrocities, within the CPML, Bernstein called for a sweeping re-examination. Bernstein won a number of allies, and by the beginning of 1980 the CPML core was split into warring factions. The rank-and-file rebelled against the leadership as a whole and began to leave in substantial numbers. As the organization went into freefall, efforts were made to breathe new life into unity efforts with other groups that supported the Three Worlds theory. But if those organizations had resisted joining CPML, at the zenith of its influence they were even more reluctant to jump onto a sinking ship, especially since the Chinese had effectively withdrawn their recognition of the CPML as their franchised U.S. party. Matters soon went from bad to worse. Amid preparations for an organization-wide congress intended to address the crisis, Bernstein declared that the root of the CPML's problems was Marxism-Leninism, resigned, and took several other key activists with him. By the time the Congress convened in the spring of 1981, CPML had lost nearly two-thirds of its membership, and the proposals presented for consideration were all over the ideological map. About the only matter that was not a subject of controversy was China's foreign policy. Virtually no one raised an eyebrow when Party Chair Klonsky stated in the summer of 1980, just as Reagan's military buildup was swinging into high gear, that China was correct to align with Washington in a worldwide anti-hegemonic front. A majority at the Congress ended up voting to reaffirm the basic principles of anti-revisionism. But even in the majority camp, most activists were on their way out. By the end of 1981, the CPML had altogether collapsed. The CPML's disintegration was strikingly different from all the previous crises that had racked major new communist groups. To begin with, it was the most rapid and complete. In less than 3 years, CPML went from being the largest anti-revisionist organization to total dissolution. Even more important, it was the first time that such an upheaval had not ended with different factions going in different directions based on different ideas of what constituted Marxism-Leninism. When the Black Workers' Congress broke up in 1974, when the entire movement divided over Angola in 1975 to 1976, and when the Revolutionary Communist Party split in 1978, the various warring parties all laid claim to being the genuine communists, but the CPML's demise was characterized by an internal challenge to the fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism on one side and a lethargic defense of those principles on the other. And in the wake of the CPML's collapse, most former members refused to affiliate with any other communist organization, with a substantial proportion abandoning left activism altogether. In part, this was due to identification of revolutionary organization with dogmatism and anti-democratic practices, but such a widespread retreat also, and more fundamentally, reflected the larger social context. Signs that anything like a substantial revolutionary-minded workers' movement was on the near-term horizon, so prevalent in 1968 to 1973, were now almost non-existent. The economic and political shifts of the 1970s had taken their toll. The OCIC self-destructs, almost simultaneously the largest formation in the rival anti-revisionist, anti-dogmatist trend went into terminal crisis. The organizing committee for an ideological center had never attained the size or coherence of the CPML. Its promise had rested on the potential to turn its critique of ultra-leftism into a well-grounded and unitary party-building process. But results by 1979 were meager. The OCIC's fusion party-building strategy, while a useful corrective to ultra-leftism as a broad orientation, proved incapable of generating much concrete analysis of the increasingly complex political landscape. Instead, it encouraged narrow localism and anti-theoretical prejudices, so the OCIC was unable to get its projected theoretical journal off the ground and failed to mount any nationally coordinated campaigns. Complicating matters further was a mounting challenge from the rectificationists and the national network of Marxist-Leninist clubs. From 1976 to 1978, the relationship between the fusion and rectification centers had consisted mainly of guarded cooperation in opposing the pro-China organizations. As the importance of that task receded with the collapse of pro-China sentiment, intense competition over whose perspective would lead those who had taken up the critique of ultra-leftism came to the fore. Though in 1980 the rectificationists still were fewer in number than the OCIC, they had qualitatively increased their relative influence. Rectification, soon to be called Line of March, started a theoretical journal in the spring of 1980, launched the National Anti-Racist Organizing Committee on the basis of its work in the anti-BAC campaign, and initiated an ambitious Marxist-Leninist education program that enrolled scores of activists. And with a central leadership composed of a majority of activists of color and more ambitious anti-racist work, rectification attracted a larger number of Black, Latino, and Asian American activists than the OCIC. The combination of internal inertia and external pressure wore on the OCIC leadership. In the fall of 1979, they abandoned their original cautious and consensus-building approach and turned to high-intensity ideological campaigns. Soon their entire focus was on conducting an internal campaign against white chauvinism, which targeted alleged racism within the membership as the OCIC's key problem. The campaign consisted of lengthy criticism sessions dissecting individuals' attitudes and psychology. The effort was all but completely divorced from any kind of grounding in practical work. Demagogy ran rampant, and during its peak the campaign turned into the worst kind of sterile purification ritual. At first, the bulk of the membership, to their credit willing to examine themselves for possible shortcomings, went along with the crusade, but by the fall of 1980 resistance had begun. When the leadership charged that its critics were merely defenders of racism, members started leaving in droves. During 1981, every OCIC activity except the campaign ground to a halt, and that October the PWOC's organizer admitted that the OCIC was near collapse with functioning local areas reduced from 18 to 6 and 80% of the membership resigned. The Philadelphia Workers' Organizing Committee itself was also in shambles. The next issue of the newspaper was its last, and by the spring of 1982 both the PWOC and the OCIC were defunct. The OCIC's implosion paralleled CPML's collapse in several respects. Again, the speed of the process stunned members and opponents alike. Though the OCIC was only a few years old, key constituent collectives like the PWOC stretched back to the movement's formative years. And for PWOC to self-destruct so soon after leading the way in carving out a new anti-dogmatist trend was a huge blow to the morale of everyone who had invested hopes in the OCIC's success. Furthermore, while the OCIC's internal conflict did not include a direct challenge to Marxism-Leninism as in CPML, the experience was at least as traumatic for the members who went through it. Few retained any energy for communist activism once the dust had settled. Most were deeply affected by the fact that an organization founded to oppose ultra-leftism reverted to some of its worst excesses, and this led many to conclude that something fundamental was wrong with Marxism-Leninism. As with former CPML members, only a small percentage of former OCIC members went on to join other Leninist groups. Death of a movement. Not all party-building organizations were swept away in the wake of the CPML's and OCIC's collapse. The most class-conscious and resolute according to their self-description, or the most narrow-minded and out of touch according to their critics, survived. Indeed, LRE's rectification and CWP were strengthened in the short term, picking up recruits and enjoying an ideological boost from victories over one-time rivals. These organizations, plus a few locally based collectives, and CLP still in self-imposed isolation, denied that there was any crisis of Marxism-Leninism. Each argued that its own work continued the positive tradition of the new communist movement and that it had overcome the problems that had wrecked once stronger rivals. Such arguments from organizations that were experiencing their moment of opportunity were nothing new, but the overall dynamic had changed dramatically. In the early and mid-1970s there were splits. This time around organizations had collapsed without factions even fighting over who got to keep the name, office, and mailing list. In the past, members of declining groups joined new ones on the rise. This time most simply abandoned political work altogether. Previously, crises were attributed to failures in applying Marxism-Leninism. In the wake of the CPML and OEIC disasters, one-time leaders declared that anti-revisionism was itself the problem. Making matters worse, the trend toward organizational dissolution turned into an epidemic. In January 1981, Elbaum MIMP split into two parts, neither of which survived more than another year or so. In 1983, Theoretical Review ceased publication, and the Communist Party USA, ML, last remaining offshoot of the Black Workers' Congress, dissolved. By this time, the West European and Canadian counterparts to the U.S. New Communist movement had also gone into crisis or completely collapsed, and so had many but not all of the anti-revisionist parties formed in the Third World. Further, by 1982 the surviving groups had less connection with one another than ever before. They shared a certain commonality of origin, but except for individuals interested in left history that was increasingly irrelevant. Most of the left had no reason to think that rectification, LRS, CLP, CWP, and a few smaller formations were part of any common movement, even one divided into two competing wings. The practice of these groups increasingly diverged and their support peripheres became almost completely separate. Instances of cooperation with or polemics against one another became no more frequent than with groups that had no connection with anti-revisionism at all. Whereas in the 1970s almost every core movement activist had some kind of political or personal history with members of other movement groups, by the 1980s there were many cadre who had no personal acquaintance with any Marxist-Leninists outside their own organization. The leaderships of some surviving groups, because of commitment to a certain framework for analyzing the left, continued to utilize the concept of an anti-revisionist or party-building movement, but this was an ideological construct less and less reinforced by realities on the ground. All this marked a qualitative change. Organizations that had originated within the new communist movement continued to pursue its original party-building goal. But as a movement, that is, as a coherent political trend encompassing both cadre organizations and a broader self-conscious periphery, this current had passed away. Obituaries and regroupment proposals. Outside of 3 or 4 intact groups, there was widespread recognition that some kind of endpoint had been reached. Beginning in 1981, several epitaphs for the movement were published by activists coming out of its ranks. One of the first, bluntly titled The New Communist Movement, an obituary, was written by former OCIC member Al Szymanski, though credited to a non-existent movement for a revolutionary left. Appearing in 1981, Szymanski's postmortem lambasted China's foreign policy and those who had followed it while attributing the failure of those who broke with Beijing to the virus of hasty party building. An obituary defended Leninism, but called for suspending efforts to build a vanguard organization. Instead, it proposed loose alliances, coalitions, and organized dialogue leading to a loose national organization allowing a considerable range of programs and factions. An obituary even urged movement veterans to consider allying with a wide range of previously shunned organizations, including the previously unthinkable CPUSA. Over the next several years, numerous variants of this so-called regroupment strategy were proposed by former party builders, as well as veterans of other left tendencies in decline. When Theoretical Review ceased publication, it echoed many of the themes that had been sounded by Szymanski. Its editors wrote that the renovating currents that had given birth to the anti-dogmatist trend had failed, and that the party-building movement has largely ceased to exist, and the independent left and community forces who once looked to it for leadership have long since been alienated by its clumsy and ineffective efforts to grope toward an exit from the closed world of its own past. From the Maoists, P.O. published What Went Wrong, a collection of articles stating that the communist movement, which took shape in the late 1960s and early 70s, had a dynamic that it has now lost and cannot regain in that particular form. PDL pillared ultra-leftism as the main culprit in the movement's fall while sticking with its defense of China's foreign policy. Indeed, a pamphlet published by a PUL-allied group went further than any other U.S. Maoist voice in advocating alliance with Washington, calling for U.S. revolutionaries to oppose withdrawal of military bases from the Philippines and Puerto Rico and to support strengthening the U.S. military. The pamphlet's title, Sooner or Later, meant that sooner or later revolutionaries would have to face the fact that they must ally with Reagan against the USSR, Crises, and other quarters. New communist movement veterans were not alone in facing up to a movement gone off track. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, activists from just about every section of the revolutionary left were trying to understand why the radical upsurge of the late 1960s and early 1970s had dissipated its strength. The Puerto Rican Socialist Party, for example, was pondering the reasons for its own stagnation and decline after 1976. Pete had decided to participate in the Puerto Rican elections held in November of that year, implicitly acknowledging that Puerto Rico was not nearing the pre-revolutionary situation it had previously anticipated. The party gained less than 1% of the vote, forcing a sweeping re-examination of strategy and policy. The U.S. branch of the PSP also undertook a basic reassessment, which included another look at the complex relationship between the struggles of Puerto Ricans on the island and those in the U.S. Despite determined probing and efforts at renovation, party militants could not reverse the group's decline. Soon basic differences erupted within the leadership, including whether or not the PSP should retain a commitment to Marxism-Leninism. By 1983, the majority of U.S. members had left, and PSP, once a galvanizing pole for a broad swath of the U.S. left as well as a formidable force within the Puerto Rican community, retained little more than a symbolic existence. In the same years, CASA experienced a similar decline. The organization's base among Mexican-American workers fell away. The group was increasingly mired in internal ideological debate, and the leadership split into several contending factions. By the 1980s, it was gone, on a different flank of the new communist movement. The International Socialists also were grappling with failure and decline. Like several other groups, IDES had turned to a party-building focus in 1975, hoping to propel itself to leadership of a resurgent workers' movement. Instead, things went downhill, and by 1979, IDES had stopped publishing its newspaper, lost all of its always relatively few black members, and undergone a difficult split. In 1980 to 1981, IS's surviving core began publishing a series of retrospectives analyzing why the revolutionary left had run aground. They argued that the entire far left, including the new communist movement, which had dominated the revolutionary left for 15 years, had overestimated the revolutionary possibilities of the previous decade, had been afflicted by ultra-left and sectarian politics, and had underestimated the difficulties resulting from the lack of a strong socialist tradition within the U.S. working class. Recognition that revolutionaries had misjudged the realities of the 1970s also came from anti-revisionism's old rivals from SDS days. In 1976, the Weather Underground went through a bitter split, in part connected to a plan advocated by several key leaders to abandon armed actions, resurface, and rejoin the above-ground left. Following this internal conflict, the entire clandestine apparatus deteriorated, and the best-known weather leaders ended up implementing the inversion plan in individual, unorganized fashion. Though the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee and a split-off group, the May 19 Communist Organization, continued to advocate the old weathermen's ultra-left and semi-anarchist outlook, the abandonment of underground activity by the tendency's most prominent leaders took most of the remaining wind out of their sails. In an entirely different corner of the revolutionary camp, the Socialist Workers' Party entered a period of crisis. Through the 1970s, the SWP was as large as the biggest new communist movement groups, though much smaller than the movement as a whole. In 1979, its leadership began to shift away from classical Trotskyist political positions, especially those that criticized the Cuban Communist Party and Nicaraguan Sandinistas for adapting to Stalinism and pursuing overly broad class alliances. The shift sparked large-scale internal resistance, and for the next 4 years the SWP was embroiled in internal conflict. A series of expulsions and splits cut the membership in half, from a post-World War II high of 1690 in 1977 to 885 in 1984. SWP was much more open about its membership numbers than any anti-revisionist group. Of those who remained active in the left after leaving the SWP, the majority formed smaller groups dedicated to defending orthodox Trotskyism. But one circle, led by former SWP presidential candidate Peter Calmejo, critiqued vanguardism, adopted a regroupment orientation, and in 1984 joined with former anti-revisionists, in particular the anti-dogmatic Bay Area Socialist Organizing Committee, to form the North Star Network. The CPUSA, in contrast, navigated through the late 1970s intact. The momentum gained in the wake of the early 1970s Angela Davis campaign had mostly dissipated and the party was not attracting many fresh recruits, but the leadership suffered no defections such as those of Dorothy Healey and Al Richmond in the early 1970s, and its networks of sympathizers, especially in labor and the black community, remained active and supportive. The CP benefited from the disarray among those who had been challenging it from the left, and also from the wave of 1970s books, memoirs, and films by new left veterans as well as longtime party supporters, celebrating its historical contributions to popular movements. Entering the 1980s, the CP was in a stronger position relative to other tendencies that claimed the mantle of Leninism than it had been at any time since the emergence of progressive labor in the early 1960s, a revival of black revolutionary nationalism, the collapse of the new communist movement and most other currents that defined themselves as both revolutionary and Marxist left a political gap just as popular movements stirred with new energy. Within the mounting anti-Reagan protests, other tendencies filled the vacuum. First, black revolutionary nationalism began to revive from the doldrums of the mid-1970s. Its resurgence drew energy from a broader upswing in grassroots black protest in 1979 to 1980. This included hundreds of black college students, union and healthcare activists, socialists, and Harlem residents demonstrating to halt the closing of New York's Sydenham Hospital, the National March to support the year-long strike of black women workers in Sanderson Farms in Laurel, Mississippi on May 17, 1980, Prime Minister Robert Mugabe's triumphant speeches at Howard University in Harlem only months after the liberation of Zimbabwe, the demonstration of black activists at the gates of San Quentin on August 30, the Great Miami Rebellion of May 1980, and popular uprisings of poor and working-class Afro-Americans in Chattanooga, Philadelphia, and a dozen different cities. Of these, the Miami Rebellion had the biggest impact, triggered by an all-white court's acquittal of 4 police officers who had beaten a black insurance executive to death. Another proximate cause was the glaring inequity between the government's treatment of Cuban and Haitian refugees arriving in Florida. More generally, the rebellion, the most economically devastating social uprising to that point in U.S. history, was rooted in long-standing grievances on every level, and it was repressed with white vigilante violence, police abuse, and murder. Grabbing national headlines, the rebellion shattered the calm facade dominating Afro-American political life since the mid-1970s. Against this backdrop, 2 new radical black organizations took shape. First was the National Black United Front, NBUF, founded at a conference of 1,000 activists in New York City June 26 to June 29, 1980. The core of the new group, which combined strands of nationalist and left politics, consisted of already existing local black united fronts in New York, Cairo, Illinois, Philadelphia, Boston, Portland, the San Francisco Bay Area, and several other cities, as well as the United League of Mississippi. Reverend Herbert Daughtry of the New York NBUF was chosen as chair. 6 months later, on November 21 to November 23, 1,300 people gathered to found the National Black Independent Political Party, NBIPP, on an explicitly anti-capitalist program. The NBIPP grew mainly out of the remnant apparatus of the National Black Political Assembly, which during the 1980 election campaign toured black communities advocating a vote for progressive candidates at the local and state level, refusal to vote for either Carter or Reagan, an organization of an independent party to build black political power. Neither the NBUF nor the NBIPP was able to mobilize the large numbers for mass action that the African Liberation Support Committee had turned out for its campaigns in 1972 to 1974, but they did galvanize and connect many black radicals and re-established a militant anti-capitalist current within the African American movement. And as in the early 1970s, surviving new communist movement groups regarded the revival of revolutionary nationalism as of great importance and deployed cadre into these new organizational initiatives. Though these cadre, from the CWP, LREs, the collapsing CPML, rectification and a few smaller groups, contributed to the development of the new radical nationalist formations, Marxism, Leninism, and its advocates gained nowhere near the initiative they had enjoyed in the early 1970s. Social democracy, in a very different racial and political milieu, left social democracy continued its organizational ascent. The merger of NM and DSOC was consummated in 1982, then the New Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, began life with 6,500 members. Because most only paid annual dues and did not participate in the group's projects, membership figures alone gave an exaggerated impression of DSA's political strength. Still, DSA began with more than 30 chapters that had at least a small activist core, and the organization was able to maintain a presence in several grassroots movements as well as participate in the post-1980 ferment within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, combined with the growth of in these times circulation to exceed the Guardians. The formation of DSA established left social democracy as the dominant trend on the socialist left. The arena where DSA focused its main energies, trying to build influence among trade union officials and liberal Democrats, had never been an area of new communist movement concentration. Therefore, social democracy's growth in that milieu did not directly compete with the main efforts of the remaining party builders. But even in areas where Marxist-Leninist cadre might have been expected to do better, their surviving organizations were unable to take much initiative. A telling example was the first large-scale protest against the Reagan administration, a May 3, 1981 demonstration against intervention in El Salvador and austerity at home. The protest, which drew 100,000 to Washington, D.C., was initiated by an organization that had been nearly invisible through the 1970s. The Workers' World Party, WWP. WWP had begun as a small 1959 split-off from the SWP, distinguished by being more sympathetic than traditional Trotskyism to socialist states and third-world communist parties. Through the 1960s and 1970s, it focused on mobilizing contingents at street protests, conducting little or no base-building work in unions or communities of color. But in 1980 to 1981, Workers' World was able to step into an open space. The new communist movement was in disarray. Organizing mass demonstrations was not on DSA's agenda. The SWP was embroiled in internal conflict, and the CPUSA remained too inflexible and worried about alienating the trade union leadership to initiate a mass protest with radical demands. But there were thousands of people around the country, both veterans of the anti-Vietnam War movement and activists from a new generation, who were ready to act against U.S. aggression in Central America. The WWP-initiated People's Anti-War Mobilization presented itself as a protest vehicle and gathered that energy into a successful national march. Forging an ongoing coalition afterwards proved more difficult. Workers' World tried to follow the march's success by calling for a broad All-People's Congress, a PC, but tried to monopolize decision-making power, and the APC soon narrowed into what amounted to a small WWP front. The main lasting contribution of the May 1981 action turned out to be establishing the pattern of spring Washington demonstrations against Reaganism, and a whole series of big peace and justice actions followed during the next 7 years. Peace, labor, solidarity. The new communist movement's remnant groups were similarly marginal to other key actions during the first 2 years of Reagan's presidency. The anchor of opposition to escalating intervention in Central America was the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPES. Founded in October 1980, CISPES explicitly backed El Salvador's FMLN and eventually grew to include hundreds of local committees with 100 full-time organizers. Though some Marxist-Leninist cadre joined or worked closely with CISPES, the organization's leadership was provided by activists indifferent or unfriendly to the party-building formations. Those groups that followed China in denouncing Cuba's role within the Americas had an especially difficult time participating constructively in Central America solidarity actions since their position echoed the Reagan administration's rationale for U.S. intervention. But even the pro-Cuba groups were peripheral rather than central to CISPES and other key anti-war formations. A similar situation prevailed in labor, where the AFL-CIO leadership was scrambling to respond to Reagan's anti-union assault. The Federation's major initiative was a Solidarity Day mobilization called for September 19, 1981. The demonstration, which opposed the administration's domestic policies but was silent about Reagan's military buildup, drew a huge turnout of 400,000. The remnants of the party-building movement, along with the rest of the left, exerted no influence on the action's demands or strategy. left participation was essentially limited to helping bring co-workers to the action and distribution of literature to those who attended. Likewise, on the anti-nuclear front, Marxist-Leninist organizations were marginal to the million-strong June 12, 1982 demonstration at the UN Special Session on Disarmament. This action was a highlight of the nuclear freeze and general anti-nuclear disarmament movement of the early Reagan years, which paralleled an even larger peace movement turning out millions across Western Europe. At the June 12 rally, a small but energetic left presence was established via Third World and Progressive People's Coalition, TWPPC, within which revolutionary nationalists exerted leadership and some cadre from Rectification and the CWP played a role. The huge June 12 demonstration took place just a week after Israel invaded Lebanon, laid siege to Beirut, and facilitated the Sabra and Shatila massacres, but the rally's central organizers stonewalled efforts to connect anti-nuclear campaigns and the fight for Palestinian rights. Activists from the TWPPC as well as others pointed out that conflict in the Middle East was consistently identified as one of the most likely trigger points for a nuclear war, and that Israel's nuclear capacity was an open secret, though officially ignored by Washington lest U.S. laws forbidding aid to such nuclear states be invoked. But the influence of Zionism among central anti-nuclear organizers prevented such points from being made from the rally platform. Outside this particular rally, however, the small U.S. movement against Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian land, arguably the most vilified peace and solidarity effort in the country, did begin to make some small headway within the left sector of this movement, represented by the November 29 Coalition Palestine Solidarity Committee. Marxist-Leninist cadre from the anti-dogmatist wing of the movement, particularly Rectification, were influential. They also built ties with the Palestinian left, with whom they shared a common critique of China's foreign policy. All told, it was a disappointing picture. A decade earlier, a new generation of Marxist-Leninists had taken up party building as the best way to prepare revolutionary-minded activists for new rounds of mass struggle ahead. Now in 1980 to 1982, the first signs of another round of struggles were in evidence. But the party-building efforts coming out of the late 1960s had not produced any organization that could play its assigned leading role. Just when the ascent of Reagan underscored the need for a left that offered both a realistic perspective for immediate action and a long-range revolutionary vision, a left with a skilled cadre corps and at least a small mass base among workers and peoples of color, the internal debacles of 1979 to 1981 closed off the possibility of the once promising new communist movement filling the bill.